Hi everyone, in today's lesson we're going to talk about how to graph trig functions with phase shifts. Yesterday you watched a video where we analyzed the trig equation and found multiple parts. So what I'd actually like you guys to do before we get into the graphing piece, I'd like you to analyze this equation and tell me what the amplitude is, what the number of cycles are, what the period is, what the interval is, what the maximum value is, what the minimum value is, and what the range is. So pause the video and take a minute and calculate those values and then hit resume when you're ready for the answer. Okay, so remember the equation. The A, or the absolute value of A, is our amplitude. So the absolute value of 2 is 2. The B value is found by looking at the cycles. B. But we have to do something first. It looks like this equation has the B value already multiplied in. And if you remember correctly, we have to get that B value out in form of a GCF. So let's do that first. So if I were to do that, maybe I'll do this on the side. We have 3x plus pi over 2. I need to divide out this 3 into both pieces. So I'm dividing both parts by 3. So these 3's will cancel, and that will give me x. So now the more complicated part is going to be to analyze that. So remember, when we divide fractions, we keep the top, change the division to a multiplication, and flip the 3 to 1/3. And then we just multiply straight across. Pi times 1 is pi. 2 times 3 is 6. So this will be 3 plus pi over 6. So my B value, if we now, instead of having it be written like this, we write it as 3 times x plus pi over 6, my B value we know is the number that's right here, right outside of the parentheses. So B is my 3. Period is defined as 2 pi over B, where B is the number of cycles. So my period is 2 pi over 3. My interval is defined as period over 4. So since my period is 2 pi over 3, I'm going to divide that by 4. So I'm keeping the 2 pi over 3, changing the division to a multiplication, and flipping the 4 to 1 over 4. 2 and 4 can simplify to a 2 on the bottom. And I multiply straight across. So pi times 1 is pi, and 3 times 2 is 6. So my interval is pi over 6. The maximum can be found by taking the midline and adding the amplitude. And the midline is this D value here. So my D value is -4. Add the amplitude of 2. So -4 plus 2 is -2. My minimum value can be found by taking the midline and subtracting the amplitude. So the midline is -4, and I'm going to subtract 2 this time, and that will give me -6. So my range is from the minimum, -6, to the maximum of -2. And the last thing I didn't ask you to find is, what direction is this phase shift? Well, since we have a plus pi over 6, we know that we are going to go left, opposite, pi over 6. So this is just some extra information that we're going to use to graph. Okay, so now I think we're ready to graph. So we know that we have a range of -6 to -2. So the importance of finding this range is so that we have the appropriate spacing. So if I know the entire graph is going to be below the x-axis, what we probably should do is draw our y-axis like normal, but then we should justify our x-axis a little bit higher because we know most of it, well, all of it, will be below the x-axis. So just a couple of tips before we get started. Make sure you have enough space and you draw a significantly long x-axis. You'll know why in a second. And the y-axis doesn't matter too much as long as it includes the values from -2 to -6. So let's first set up our x-axis. Our x-axis is what we count by, and that is our interval. So interval is pi over 6, so I'm going to count by sixths. So 1/6, 2/6, 3/6, 4/6, 5 6 6 6. So 6 6 pi. 7 6 8 6 9 6 10 6 11 6 12 over 6, 12 pi over 6. So that is your 2 pi, and this is your pi. Now I can go back and I can simplify and make it a little bit easier to see. So pi over 6, 1/6, 2/6, 3/6, 4/6, 5/6, and 6/6, 7/6, 8/6, 9/6, and 10/6, and 11/6. So take a minute and pause the video if you need to, just until you've got a proper x-axis. Then I'd like you to have your y values labeled. So the y values need to range from -2 to 6. So since I used most of that space, I'm going to count by 2's. So this will be -1, -2, -3, -4, -5, and -6. Since our midline is -4, I'm actually going to take the liberty of drawing in a dotted line to represent my midline. All right, please make sure you're staying up to date. If you need to pause the video, please do so to catch up. Okay, so now I want to graph a negative cosine curve. Well, we know negative cosine curves start at the minimum, in this case, -6. So if we weren't shifting left pi over 6, we would actually start the graph here and go up and down as follows. But we're going to do the same thing. We're just going to start it left pi over 6. So since the graph doesn't show that, we kind of have to draw one more tick mark, I guess, to the left, which we'll call this negative pi over 6. And we're actually going to start the graph there. So negative pi over 6, and then the midline, the minimum value, is actually down there. That's negative pi over 6. And we're just going to follow the 4 points or 5 points of a cosine curve. Down at the minimum, then your midline, then your max, your midline, and your min. So I did my first dot, which is down here at my minimum, then my midline, then my max, then my midline, then my min, midline, max, min, midline, keep going, and connect all of your dots. Now, once you have all of your dots, all you're going to do, since I only want this graph from 0 to 2 pi, I have to tell you that. I don't think I did yet, but I want the graph from 0 to 2 pi. So what that would mean is we're actually going to start our graph at 0 and just connect every one of these dots. And we're not going to include this value here because it's not in between 0 and 2 pi. So if you look at what you just graphed, doesn't this graph now look like a sine curve from 0 to 2 pi because it starts at the midline? So that's actually really interesting about phase shifts, is if you have a phase shift and it starts out as a cos, it may look like a sine curve when you're done. So it's very important that you have your start value. So you could call this your start value. Just do not connect from it if it's not included in the interval that you are given, which is 0 to 2 pi. All right, that's it. Jot down any questions that you might have, and don't forget to ask us in class tomorrow. All right, have a good night.